Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Roundtable. Today, I have my friend Michael Frost joining me. We're going to talk a little bit about the communication methods and how communication has changed specifically within the text arena. How are you doing today, Michael?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that you are a very knowledgeable person as it comes to text messaging, SMS, and all of that. But just to kick it off, for those of you that are not familiar, or for those watching that are not familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your firm?
Sure. Started in this industry, in the debt collection industry, back in the early 2000s. So I was working for a debt collection law firm while I was in law school. That was my first introduction to the market, and honestly fell in love with the process and the industry itself. Spent a few years there, and then went to a larger collection agency where I operated and was a shareholder there for about 15 years. Saw massive growth during that time. Had a really good ride. And about 2 years ago, shifted gears and went to a defense firm, Malone Frost Martin. Partnered up with a very close friend of mine, Robbie Malone and Receivables Martin, who have been great defenders of this industry for a very long time. And knowing that I was going to bring compliance to the table, obviously had to have partners that were very well versed and capable of doing the litigation work, which that is not my forte. So it was a really good partnership, and we've experienced some great growth over the last 2 years, and have really provided a service to our clients that we feel very proud of. So it's been a fun ride.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I know, as you and I have met at, I don't remember which RMAI conference it was, but at one of the conferences, we sat down and you started telling me things about text messaging that I'm like, all right, now I got to go home and research. So for those that, maybe don't know as much about texting and kind of that communication method, can we talk a little bit about like SMS versus MMS and long codes, short codes, right? Like there's a lot of vernacular that kind of goes into text messaging that I was unfamiliar with early on. And I just feel like that's something valuable for everyone to kind of learn a little bit about.
For sure. Yeah, from a high level, it's, texting, you would think you grab your phone and you text day in and day out. Everybody probably texts more than they even speak in some situations. I know my kids do for sure. They'll be in the back of the car and texting back and forth, and not having communication with each other. So you don't think about all of the things that happen in the background to actually, create that text message. And there are different ways to do it. Short codes and long codes are things that you probably have heard of in that space before. Really, that short codes are assigned specifically to the entity. Long codes can be, you can have multiple different long codes that you can utilize through the same entity. So there has been a shift. We've seen a lot of changes in this area as recently as in the last month or so. Where T-Mobile's come out with some of their new requirements surrounding their code of conduct and how text messages need to be sent to consumers. And the CTIA has a lot of requirements around opt-ins and, different, processes and how you can actually generate a text message to a consumer. So there's been a lot of changes and a lot of issues surrounding text messages. It's, especially in the last 30 to 60 days. We saw a lot of it last year on the political side. So as the political text messages were really, really rampant, there was a lot of questions around that process and how that unveiled. We're kind of going through the same thing now with texting. What's really interesting is a few years back when the prior administration was in, before Trump and the Obama administration, we had something that was called Operation Choke Point. And it was an area where debt collection agencies and debt buyers and the like would have a relationship with the bank. And essentially what they were trying to do is choke off that relationship. So those banks were basically said, hey, you can't utilize, work with payday lenders, with debt collectors and things of that nature. What we're starting to see is the same thing through the FCC's rule, where the FCC was required to provide some guidance to carriers to try to reduce the number of robocalls that are being generated through our through society. And unfortunately, it's just like any other regulation. We're aiming to try to curb a certain behavior by a group of people, and we end up regulating all of the companies that are that have business relationships with consumers, and that should actually be in contact with them. So what we've been seeing as of late is a lot of a shift in mentality in how those text messages can be sent, and kind of as we actually have seen some of these letters that have come out that have from some of the carriers that are suggesting that certain types of businesses should not be texting. And, it's problematic from a standpoint of, if you have consent, which has been deemed consent for many, many years, they're changing the rules around what an opt-in truly is. Can it be a direct opt-in? Can it be an opt-in from the creditor that passes to the debt collector or the debt buyer? A bunch of issues like that. And then what type of, messages can be sent? Is it, the short versus the long code? Is it the, a dynamic text is how I verbalize it, which is an MMS. MMS versus an SMS. An SMS text is really just a bubble that you get, a normal text message. An MMS could be a JPEG, a picture. It could be a PDF. So we have, there's companies today. I was hired by a company called SendRite about a year and a half ago to help them vet through their technology platform and that stack. And they utilize a peer-to-peer texting solution, which we can talk about as well, it really helps overcome some of the TCPA obstacles. But, in their process, they actually built out the capabilities to be able to send messages, through an MMS platform that can include PDF and password protection. So they can encrypt a document, provide the information to the consumer in a JPEG that basically says, hi, if this, it doesn't actually have any consumer information in it. So it doesn't, it just says essentially, to access your password protected PDF, please, type in the last four of your social security number, your date of birth, some unique identifier to that consumer. Then they would press on the link to an S3 bucket. An S3 bucket is essentially a cloud-based bucket that is delivered to the consumer. It's not taking them to a website where they can open then that document in a cloud environment that they can access for, as long as the client, leaves the account out there in that bucket. By utilizing that password protect, model. They type in their date of birth, let's say, and then populates the actual validation notice or a subsequent notice that would flow through that process. So we've seen agencies, exploring this opportunity. Some are, sending out just a Zortman style message. So they're using the SMS process. We actually use contact cards, which is an interesting process as well. So a contact card that you would get through your phone, they embed all of the information in that contact card. So what shows up with the consumer is just a contact card. When they open it up, it gives the name of the company, it gives a link to their payment portal, it gives a direct link to be able to dial their phone back if they want to dial back in and speak to the agents. You can provide whatever language in there you want to too. So if you want disclosures and things like that inside that contact card, you can put all that in there. So that's another area that we've explored for some of the blocking issues and some of the areas where you can be able to provide more information to a consumer. The other thing that does is in many new smartphones, if they have that contact card and they click on it and they drop it into their phone, so when they have the contact issues where they would normally block something that's not in their contacts, which you can do with the iPhone 12s, that would bypass that issue as well. So it's not going to get blocked when the consumer may want to speak to the agency. So some really cool technology and some different opportunities to be able to get through some of those areas. But it really is going to boil down to, what is the long-term objective of the carriers and how is that going to flow out through business? Because not only debt collectors are on that list, but banks and auto lenders and mortgage lenders. You think about a mortgage lender and they have a direct communication and they have collateral with a loan that they've provided to a consumer, and yet the carriers are suggesting they're going to block their ability to be able to text that consumer, which is really
they're
odd.
Struggling with these unintended consequences because you're talking about communication organizations that know how to set up towers and flow some data, but are not necessarily as well versed in how to communicate with the consumer. Otherwise, AT&T and Verizon would be more popular with their users. I have yet to meet someone who's like, I really love my phone company. Maybe they should stay focused on that, but we'll see.
Well, yeah, and even what's more interesting is those same carriers are placing accounts with third-party debt collectors and selling debt to debt buyers, and then they're blocking the calls through this carrier block process on accounts that are owed to them. So that one's always baffled me is, hey, not only are we blocking calls from debt collectors, but we're blocking our own calls that we've contracted you to go try to collect. So
two for us.
Obviously some pains with that right now, some growing pains, and hopefully we can get some
It's like any new regulation, though. Like, it's going to have to go through a process of of the people trying to put these rules in place, understanding the unintended consequences that are created through their good intentions, right? Like they set out with a specific set of intentions, but the result does not always reflect their intention.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, they'll continue to explore and learn as they go through this process, so that we can kind of not have so many problems that are unnecessary with consumers really the preference shifting towards text messaging. And I text probably 4 times the amount that I am on the phone because it's just easier for me. But I think as we talk about like how people have moved from the telephone to text messaging, and looking at these new modes of communications, how does that affect the ability to collect a debt?
I think it's actually beneficial to agencies that have figured out the technology. Because if you think about it, it all boils down to consumer preference.
Mhm.
And consumer preference is, like you just stated, I'd rather text than talk on the phone. It's an ability for you to be able to pick up that message and communicate with that company or individual at your time and at your leisure, instead of being bombarded with a phone call. And that phone call could happen. I mean, I'll end up getting a phone call, and so will you, while we're on this podcast. And we're not going to answer those calls. But if I get a text, as soon as I get that text, I'm not going to grab it and answer it, but I'm going to walk down the hall, probably go to the bathroom, whatever, after our conversation. And first thing I'm going to do is check my text messages.
Yeah.
So the funny thing about when you look at the statistics around text, a text is 12 times more likely to be responded to than a telephone call, and even higher rate than email. So email is another component that people have really focused on over the last few years. I mean, it's nothing new. I know agencies that have been emailing for 10 years, but the processes are being more developed, more customized, and they're getting machine learning behind it, like the True Accord model and some of the other agencies that are doing some of that type of work. Indebted is another company that's kind of new to the marketplace, but has a technology stack that's fairly impressive. So you look at those types of opportunities that people have, and not only are they looking at the email process, but that you think about the texting process. Not only are people 12 times more likely to answer text, but there's a high probability they're going to answer that text within 5 minutes of the time that they receive it. So if you think about that from a real-time communication channel and opportunity, when it's a good place or in a good location, not inconvenient for the consumer, there's probably going to be a dialogue, and we're going to get the account resolved, or find out what options are available to the consumer. And that's 90% of the game. I mean, the first person to RPC is usually the winner, right, in this space.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, that you think about that from a text perspective, if you can get to RPC soon, jump back and have a conversation, dialogue with the consumer, and get them the information they need to make a decision. That decision may be, I'm not going to pay my account. But as long as they get the information, that's the important piece of this whole puzzle. So I think it's a very effective
benefit to the consumer, right? Like for me, it's all about response time, right? Or what does it take? If I get on the phone with somebody, I'm going to be on for at least 5 minutes, right? There's pleasantries, there's all the rest. But if somebody sends me a text message, I can respond inside of 10 seconds, and now I'm responding to 10 times as many messages, and it just simplifies my process. Especially if I get them through my computer and I can use a keyboard instead of playing on my phone.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like my response rate is just considerably higher. And I think as you look at email as a communication channel, that's something where filtration has become incredibly sophisticated. Now, I mean, there has been some of it from a text messaging standpoint. I personally have used RoboKiller for many years after they won the FTC contest, whatever it was, 3-4 years ago. And it's a great little tool, but not filtered at the same rate that like my spam filters are running on my email.
Right.
So I can imagine it's much more difficult to actually communicate with somebody. And now I know we're talking about omni-channel solutions and other things that kind of brings everything together. But to me, text is kind of my communication preference. And I have a feeling that there's a lot of people in my age bracket and lower that are going to feel that same way, because it's just how they've done it, right? It's been kind of the trend. But now we're looking at even more changes coming to our abilities to communicate with the new Reg F coming down and I believe going into effect in November. Tell us a little bit about how Reg F is going to change text messaging for the receivables management space.
It's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of different opinions on Reg F and what impact it has, especially when you talk about 1006.6, which is the area that talks about email and text communications. And quite honestly, the easiest way for me to sum this up is that section really provides a very limited safe harbor. So if you get into the detail and the commentary in the rule, it really talks more about what is that safe harbor and how is it going to be applied. And the safe harbor, if you follow this fairly erroneous process that the CFPB laid out for either email or text, text you can't even comply with it today because you have to bounce it up against a database every so often that doesn't exist today, right? So you really can't even comply in today's environment. Obviously, the rule is not effective until November, but even when it is, and if that database is up there, that's a pretty onerous responsibility on a creditor and a debt collector to be able to comply with that. And all you obtain really, if you do follow that entire rigid requirement, is you get a very limited safe harbor, whatever that really is, for unintended third-party disclosures. Nothing else. So the only thing that happens is if you do follow all in that prescribed responsibility there that's provided in the rule, then you're going to get an unintended third-party disclosure safe harbor. Now, does that mean that that you're never going to get sued for it? No, it's not there's no limitation on a consumer filing a lawsuit against you, and the courts are going to have to vet these things out. So the courts are going to look at the rule as what the CFPB's perspective is on it today. It's no different than an FCC or a CFPB declaratory opinion. Those opinions are probably even more powerful than the safe harbor because the safe harbor is so limited in context. And that's why I think, I don't know that the industry is probably going to change a whole lot from what they're doing today from a texting perspective, simply for the fact that many people are using what is known as a peer-to-peer texting solution, which goes into the TCPA governance. But those peer-to-peer texting solutions allow you to, one, comply with the TCPA. There's already an FCC declaratory opinion on that came out in 2020, which basically says if you're using a peer-to-peer texting solution, that there's no TCPA governance because it's not an ATDS as defined by the statute. So a very solid, FCC opinion that's out there. Again, you're going to get sued. Companies are getting sued today on texting. And what are they doing? They're providing that as a defense mechanism, filing a motion to dismiss based on an FCC declaratory order. Will that happen? Will it get dismissed? We don't know yet. We haven't seen that in the courts today. So the same thing will happen. It's not a litigation exemption. It's a safe harbor. So you're still going to get sued. You're still going to have to go through
defense. It's not an actual protection.
Correct. And it's not. And some of the things are really interesting when you look at the rule, and this is probably going off a little bit of a tangent, but when you talk about like the 7 and 7 rule on your outbound calls, it's a rebuttable presumption. So essentially what that's saying is, hey, the burden of proof really shifts because you made more than 7 phone calls in a 7-day period. So prove why you didn't violate the rule. When you look at the actual underlying statute, the statute talks about intent. So we've had a ton of different cases out there in the world that say 7 call attempts in a day, and that's one of my old cases. 7 call attempts in a day is not a violation. And why? Because you have to look at the intent of the caller. So what is the process? What safeguards do they have? Look at the policies and procedures to determine if there's a violation. And now you're basically just saying, hey, 7 calls in a 7-day period is a violation without looking at intent. So are we going to be able to challenge that in the courts? Because does the CFPB actually have rulemaking authority that allow them to change the actual definition of a statute? It's a question that's not answered today, and it's something that we'll probably have to deal with after November. But the very same thing is happening in this texting world. As there's not a lot.
You're going to be busy in December, is what it sounds like to me.
More than likely, there's probably going to be a lot of plaintiffs' counsel testing the waters on a lot of these different theories, and especially the letters. So, when it comes back to the text, it's really probably less. There's more ambiguity around what that rule actually really does for texting solutions, and is there really that much protection that's provided? My opinion is not much. The one nice thing that was in the rule that was really interesting is the fact that the limited content message for voicemails was not extended to text messages. That was really good for debt collectors because most of them are using the Zortman style message today for texting, but when they send an SMS. And when they do that, it's not a communication under the FDCPA in every circuit with the exception of the 11th Circuit. They had a case there called Hart versus Credit Control, where they found that a Zortman style message is in fact a communication under the FDCPA. But in every other jurisdiction, Basically the rule is that disorientation message is not a communication under the FDCPA today. So that allows them to send that bubble style text without putting every disclosure under the sun that they're required to put, under the FDCPA into that one text message. So that was a really important rule that people probably glassed over, but understanding that you don't have to use that limited content message in a text message is a huge win for the industry.
That's a really interesting, point of view. I had not really considered it from that perspective, but I can say without a doubt, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. And today will be no different. It sounds like, really there's been this new communication method being text messaging that's grown over these years. We're now starting to see more and more regulation that is coming up around it. And it really sounds like we're not going to hear a whole lot more or get real clarity in this until it starts to litigate, which inevitably will start in November or December. I can tell you through through the work that I do with Branding Arc that I am seeing some of the plaintiffs' attorneys start to spin up their attacks on that area to try and drum up consumers to guinea pig their litigation process. I can see it in the code. It's happening now, and they're gearing up for it. So I hope our industry is preparing for their defense as well, because that is a problem that is bound to arise with some pretty significant consequences. But really, just such great information, Michael. I can't thank you enough.
Absolutely, thank you. It's a good time. I appreciate being on.
So for those of you that are watching, if you have any questions about text messaging or really anything compliance related in general, you can leave a comment below, and Michael and I'll be happy to respond to those. On the flip side, if you have any additional guests you'd like to see me interview or topics that you'd like to see us cover, please feel free to leave a comment below, and we are starting to create some videos based on that feedback. So really excited to have our receivables community getting more involved in our program here. But for now, very much appreciate you taking the time to participate in today's session. And we're going to have to do a follow-up in like November, December, once we start to get some more clarity to where we can share some more information with our viewers here. But for now, thank you very much for helping out today.
Yeah, thank you. Anytime. I'd look forward to sometime after November as well. So we'll see how things play out.
Awesome. Well, we will talk to you soon, and have a great day.
All right. Take care. You too.